Hi, I'm Annie,
I'm Sam.
and we're here to make 19th century stew. We both wanted to make, well, I'm gonna make, but Sam wanted to join me for this episode because we both have memories of eating stew during our childhoods, both growing up in Canada. So I remember my grandma always used to make it in the winter after we would play outside and we're all chilly. She'd always have it on the stove, especially with a beef short rib. It was super good. So I've always enjoyed stews, especially with a good Yorkshire pudding.
Definitely. Kind of the same as Annie. I want, like she said, I kind of wanted to participate in this video, although I won't be actually making the stew. Just be involved because I do have a lot of memories of eating stew growing up. We would have dumplings and stew, and we just it's just such a good, it warms your belly. It's awesome. So yeah, I wanted to see, if there are any differences or how it's changed, and I thought this was really interesting. So thanks for having me on the call, Annie.
Yeah, I'm excited. So, a little bit about our museum. Murney Tower Museum is a small local museum operated by Kingston Historical Society in partnership with Parks Canada. We have over 1,000 domestic artifacts as well as military artifacts, and we offer tours, exhibits, and educational programs such as this one. Murney Tower was built in 1846, and it's a part of the Kingston fortifications in the Rideau Canal. We've also been the oldest operating museum in Kingston. We're going to celebrate our 96th anniversary this year being a museum, which is really great. So Sam, are you going to introduce us to the regiment that we're going to speak about today?
Yeah, for sure. So our stew recipe kind of comes from the era of the RCRR officers and when they would have lived in the tower, which was from the year 1848 to 1870. The RCRR stands for the Royal Canadian Rifle Regiment, and they were kind of an elite force of soldiers who had to have at least 10 to 15 years of service prior to getting this position. The neat thing about these officers is that they actually lived inside the tower. And not only did they just live with each other, but they also lived with some of them with their wives and their kids. Obviously, because the tower was their home where they slept, go to the bathroom, everything, they also had to eat. So the stew, is something that they probably would have eaten in the tower. And we know this because
Oh, because I was reading the archaeological reports that we recently acquired from Parks Canada. They did a dig in our ditch in the 90s, and they found that during the era of the Royal Canadian Rifle Regiment that there were more bowls than plates. So usually that means that they were most likely eating more stews and soups. So that's a pretty good indicator of why we're going to make this. We also know that in their daily schedule, they would have eaten this normally around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So it wouldn't be their supper, it would be a midday meal. Their breakfast, as we heard in the bread episode, consisted of just coffee and brown bread, which, if they wanted to, they could save that brown bread during the day for their lunch, which by then, because they couldn't wrap it, would be quite dry. um, and the stew would most likely be begun in the morning and it would simmer during the day until lunch. Then by supper, which is usually around 6 o'clock in the evening, they either had to save that stew and bread again until the evening, but as we all know, people get hungry, and that was usually not the case. They probably would have eaten it all, and then they would have to fend for themselves in the evening and buy things, which is pretty intense because that's what rationing is all about, really. So, Sam, like, where would their ingredients come from? Like, how would they get their meat?
for sure. So we can assume that some products were locally sourced, such as like the vegetables. Um, and although there might have been, like beef farms or there would have been cow farms to get their beef, a lot of their beef would have actually been salted beef shipped over from England. So as we can imagine, the beef would have been very, very dry, especially after simmering in a pot. So I don't think that, the recipe that we make today might not be, just like the one back then, but I think that's okay. So yeah, that's where probably a majority, or where we can assume a majority of their products came from. And because they were rationed, there was also sometimes leftovers, as you said, sometimes not. A cool fact that we kind of stumbled upon is the stove that's in Murney Tower is not removable, or the pot on the stove, I mean, sorry, is actually not removable. So as much as, we enjoy leftovers once they've been properly stored, our CRR officers would have enjoyed their leftovers that have been sitting in a pot for sometimes days, because there was no way of washing the pot. So yeah, that's a delicious little fact.
So they must have either scraped it out or just left it and added to it, right?
Exactly. A lot of the time they probably would have kept adding to what they had, again, because they were rationed, so it would make the pot fuller. So yeah, now that we have a bit of a background kind of about where the recipe came from and why we've decided to do it, I'll hand it over to Annie, our master chef here. And she can kind of talk about her experience making the recipe and kind of some tips and tricks and what she's learned.
Yeah, so another day this week, Sam and I tested this recipe together. I was cooking it on the stove, which we filmed for you guys, so we're gonna add that in after this little introduction. I got this recipe from Parks Canada Heritage Gourmet because they adapt 19th century recipes. And the recipe comes from Fort Wellington, where the Royal Canadian Rifle Regiment was actually stationed. So I thought, hey, this is a really if I could get any more legitimate than this for this era, then, So for this recipe, they actually had a really cute anecdote with it about where the word potluck comes from. So when they made this stew, it would be shared among the soldiers, obviously, and the officer would select who got which bowl. And you were considered to have the potluck if you had a good serving of vegetables and meat. If you sometimes the servings would not all be equal, and you maybe just get a bunch of vegetables, maybe like one piece of meat, maybe just a bunch of broth. It wasn't consistent in any way. So the potluck is if you have a great serving, which I thought was really funny and also kind of sad. And nowadays, we don't really think of a potluck that way. So it's always very interesting to hear where these words come from in our culture. So for ingredients, obviously, Sam told us all about the delicious salted beef. For this, however, I wanted my beef to be very tender, as we all do. So when you're buying your beef, try to avoid stewing beef unless you want to simmer it for about half the time, because stewing beef can get very tough because it's very lean. So the beef that I used was I think it was a bottom roast. I'm no professional with cuts of beef, but I believe it was a bottom roast. I'm gonna write it in the recipe for you just so it's there. I also recommend, if not that piece, using a chuck or a bone-in short rib if you want to be really fancy, or even a fatty brisket, like a point brisket would be really good. Anything with good marbling of fat is what you want. And trust me, it all renders out. I didn't have any big bits of fat in my beef when I tried it. It was very delicious. So for other ingredients, you will need some butter, some diced onion, some celery, carrots, salt and pepper, and a bit of cabbage to add in at the end, which I was unsure about, but it was actually really good. So don't doubt the cabbage. As well, you only season with salt and pepper. I found that to be a little bland when I tried it. Of course, in their ration, all they had was salt and pepper. So really, it's all they could have. But since we're in a modern kitchen, I added some thyme leaves and some sage and rosemary into my stew because I like herbs a lot. So I added like a couple teaspoons of each in the last half hour just for a bit more flavor. As well, I would recommend using a bit of beef broth mixed with water for your liquid, just because, of course, our beef probably isn't as flavorful as 19th century beef anyway, because of how it's farmed. So I added a bit of beef broth to my water just to add more beefy flavor. And if you do use beef broth, be careful with your salt amount, because some broth is already salted. So you don't want to, too much salt's not good. And my last tip for you would be don't doubt the potatoes thickening the sauce at the end. It was actually amazing as the potatoes simmer in the stew. They actually create a really thick gravy. You don't need to add any flour or gravy thickener. I found it was a really good thickness of sauce. Like some people maybe want it thicker, but I think if you let the potatoes simmer and you stir it in, the starch from the potatoes thickens your gravy. It was really cool to watch, actually. It was like, wow, it's like an experiment. So overall, it was really delicious, and it only took me about 2 hours in total, about an hour and a half-ish for the beef to stew, which you'll see in our video. And then just about maybe half an hour at the end to have the potatoes cooked, to have the carrots soften up at the end, and the cabbage just all simmer together. It was really yummy. And I have some in my freezer because it makes so much, so it can feed your whole family. Unfortunately, it's just me and Matt, my partner here, so we couldn't eat a whole pot of stew that's probably meant for like 6 people. So I have enough for leftovers, which is the best part about making stew.
And you don't have to leave it in the pot all the
Yes, you don't have to leave it in the pot. Luckily, I have a freezer. So
well,
yeah,
that's great, Annie.
it was a good experience, and we hope you all try it out. So I'm going to include the written instructions and the ingredient list with their measurements in this video at the beginning now, and I'll post it in at the end too. So if you need to pause the video, you're welcome to just read it over and try it out yourself. Now we're going to transition into me and Sam cooking this recipe on my little humble stove in Kingston. So we hope you all enjoy it. See you. Thanks, Sam.
You're welcome.
So hi everyone, we're back. My butter finally melted. I did just take it from the fridge, so it took a while. So now my beef is frying in the butter, which is quite yummy. Just so you guys know, I have not added any salt or pepper to this because we add it later in the stew. So I'm just, consistently turning my beef, start browning it. And I will come back once my beef is done browning. As you can see, I have quite a bit of it in here. So I'll be back in a sec, and I will show you what you do next with your vegetables. Okay, and I'll stop again. So hi everyone. I browned the beef for a bit. It took me a little longer than I anticipated because I have a lot of beef in here. So as you can see, it's all browned up a bit. Of course, it's not cooked through in any capacity. So now I'm gonna add my carrots and celery, not carrots, what am I saying? Onion and celery, haha, to the pot. And I'm gonna mix that in. And you're supposed to let the onions get soft or a little brown if you can. I maybe should have used a bigger pot. We'll see what happens. I mean, this is a pretty big pot, so we'll see. So here, I'm just mixing her all in. As you can see, my pot's already extremely liquidy because I have all the fat in this beef is already rendering out a bit. So I have a lot of butter and beef fat in the bottom. Do not drain that out. Because again, they would not have drained that out. That probably would have been a delicacy for these people. And I think it's a delicacy for now anyway. Because normally you would drain your beef after frying it nowadays. And again, we always pay more money for more fatty, expensive pieces of meat now. And before, that was just the standard. So let's try to be as realistic as possible. Of course, if you like a leaner beef, I would possibly recommend for you to drain the fat, or you stewing beef, just cook it for less time because you don't want chewy beef. So Sam, I'm just finishing browning all these vegetables, and then we will add our liquid and let this simmer. So hi everyone, as you can see now, our stuff is all rolling and boiling. So now it calls for 1 liter or 4 cups of liquid. So I did 2 cups of water and 2 cups of beef broth just to add a bit more flavor and depth. There's also a bit of salt in the broth, obviously, so just be careful with your amount of salt intake, especially if you use salted butter as well. So I'm just gonna pour that in. And now we want to bring this to a boil. As well, we want to skim off any foam that forms at the top. So since I already have my lovely measuring cup here, I'm just going to skim it off and put it in the cup because you don't want that fat foam on top. So as I do that, I'll let you know when it gets to a boil. So I'm just going to skim this off now. Okay, so our stew is now at a rolling boil. You want to have it boiling this or simmering for an hour and a half or until your beef gets tender with a fork. Then Sam and I are going to be back to show you the next steps to finish your stew. So we'll see you in an hour or until my beef gets tender. Okay, bye. Hi, everyone. We're back after an hour and a half-ish. As you can see, the liquid has reduced all the way down. It's been simmering for quite a while, and my beef is tender to stick a fork through now. So I have chopped my cabbage. Oh, my cabbage. There's about 2 cups here. So we're adding that to the pot and giving her a stir. As well, I've chopped my carrots and my potatoes. We'll let my cabbage reduce a bit down and cook down a little bit because it's a lot. Okay. So here is my potatoes and carrots I've chopped down. As you can see, I've done like little cubes because the goal of the potato at this point is to help thicken the stew as it cooks using the starch of the potato. However, if you find it's too thin after stirring it for a while, you can use like a gravy thickener such as this and whisk it into your sauce. However, be careful because these are quite salty, and if you add salt throughout this whole process, you don't want it to be extremely salty. So we're going to add this into our stew and let this simmer for about 25 minutes. Let's hope it all fits in my pot. So I did about 4 small carrots and I did about 4 medium potatoes. And the potatoes have to be peeled in order for them to release all their starches. So we hope everyone enjoys their stew. I will show a nice finished product picture when I eat it for dinner tonight. I'll put it at the end of this video. And we hope everyone likes it. So yeah, email us your pictures of your food if you'd like for info@murneytower.com or post it on Instagram. And yeah, thank you to everyone for watching.
Thank you, Annie, for inviting me along. It was really fun. Learned so much. So thank you to all of our viewers, and we'll see you in episode 3.
See ya.